Okay, so in this part of the lesson, we're going to focus on the part of the breathing system where the air that we breathe in, so for example, the oxygen that we breathe in, how it gets from the lungs, for example. So here's um, a picture of the lungs. So how does it get from the lungs, for example, into the bloodstream? So that's the kind of the next part that we want to look at. So in the last couple of lessons, we looked at the breathing system itself and the parts of the breathing system. And now we want to kind of focus in on, so imagine the air travels right out to the end here, um, and this part of the lung, or these what are known as air sacs, they're called the alveolus. So you can think about them as tiny little air sacs that are surrounded by tiny blood vessels called capillaries. So if you have a look at this here, so this is actually an image of a alveolus. So you can see here that this is just a tiny section, let's say, of a piece of lung like this, and there are millions and millions of these tiny air sacs in here, and you're going to have millions and millions of capillaries surrounding these air sacs as well. So what happens is basically the air comes down here, it comes down through the trachea, down through the bronchus, into the bronchiole, and then right out to the very end, out to these tiny air sacs called capillaries. And this is kind of a zoomed in version of these tiny air sacs, which are called capillaries. And we just focus on this now. So this is kind of like what they look like on the outside. So they're tiny. So we see here we have this what's known as the bronchiole. Okay, so this is just like a tube that carries the air down into these sacs. Um, and each of these little air sacs, are what are known as alveolus. So this is the point where, for example, the air that has been transported into the lungs through the nose, for example, down into the trachea and into the lungs, this is where it now transfers from the lungs, for example, into the bloodstream. And what also happens as well, the waste products that have been produced in the body that are carried by the bloodstream back to the lungs, they also diffuse or move into these air sacs and then up through the bronchiole, up through the trachea, and then we breathe them out. So every time we breathe in and breathe out, even now as we're speaking, we're breathing in and breathing out, this process is actually occurring. So if we take, for example, one of these little air sacs here and one of these capillaries, and we zoom right in to them and look at it and see kind of like what it looks like. So this is kind of what it looks like. So this here, this kind of bulb here, represents the alveolus. So it represents one of these tiny little air sacs. And remember, there are millions of them within the cell. So we can see here, and the lining around, like the border, if you like, around these air sacs are very fine and very thin. And around it then you have this hair, which is a blood vessel, which is a capillary. And if we remember, capillaries as well are very thin. They're like literally one cell thick. So the reason they're very thin is what they do is they actually allow what's known as gases to exchange uh, into and out of the bloodstream, for example. So this is kind of like what it looks like. So imagine we breathe in air. So inside the air, there is what's known as oxygen. So O2 or oxygen, and our body really needs oxygen. So it's trying to get this oxygen into the bloodstream and down to the cells. And what happens is, this oxygen, it basically it builds up. Let's say there will be a high concentration of oxygen when we breathe in, for example, here within this air sac. And what's going to happen is it's going to what's called diffuse, or with this process of diffusion. So it's going to travel from this area where it's highly concentrated, and it's going to pass this tiny membrane, and it's going to go into the bloodstream. So it is. And when it goes into the bloodstream, inside the bloodstream, we have red blood cells, and they will actually, the oxygen will attach onto the red blood cells. And then what will happen is this blood that's rich in its blood is high in oxygen. There's a high oxygen content in the blood. This is then transported around the body and it goes to the cell. Now, also as well, so like when all this oxygen transfers over into the blood, what happens is the blood becomes highly oxygenated, and then this oxygenated blood is rich in oxygen. It's going to pass then around the body, and it's going to go to the cells, and it'll be involved in the process of respiration. Now, also what's really interesting is the body also uses this as an opportunity to get rid of waste. So if we think about carbon dioxide and water vapor, for example, these are like waste products of respiration. And what's going to happen is that they will build up in a high concentration in the blood. So the body needs to get rid of these guys out of the body, otherwise they're going to become toxic and they're going to kill the body. So what will actually happen is these water vapor and CO2, they will transport from the capillary into the alveolus, and then what will happen is they will transfer and then up, like for example, up from these tiny air sacs here, they'll go up into the bronchus, up through the trachea, and then we'll breathe them out. Now, I mentioned this process of diffusion, so this is kind of really important as well, is to kind of understand how this whole mechanism of how this, for example, oxygen gas, how it transports into the blood, and then how the water vapor and CO2 gas, how it transfers out of the blood into the lungs and then out of the body. So this process of diffusion, so what is this exactly? So diffusion, if we think about, if we think about when, for example, your favorite piece of food is being cooked, or you smell your favorite piece of food. So imagine we have, so this is the, let's say, a sample of here, and imagine this is the smell. So this here is like the molecules of the food that's being cooked. It's in a gas form. Okay, so it's in the air. And what will happen is these molecules will they'll actually start to move around in the air. So they'll start to kind of spread out. And this is just like a natural process that happens. And eventually what's going to happen is they will go from this area here, for example, where they're all kind of clumped together. So there's like a high concentration. And they will spread out until they completely like fill up, for example, this whole section of air. And this process is what's known as diffusion. So basically you can think about diffusion. So imagine, so basically if I have a gas and it's in, so for example it's here like this, it's really highly concentrated. So there's a lot of this gas here. So for example, this could be O2 or oxygen. So imagine inside the alveolus here, what will happen is you're going to have like a really high concentration. When you breathe in, for example, there's going to be a really high concentration of oxygen in this space. And what naturally will start to happen is this oxygen will move into space that it can actually move into. So if there's a high concentration of oxygen here and there's a low concentration here, so this is high concentration, or there's a lot of it here, and then here is low, so it's low concentration, what's going to happen is the gas will naturally move in this direction. Okay, so it moves from an area of high concentration into areas of low concentration because it needs the space. Okay, so it wants to get in here and get it, and that's what happens. So the blood, for example, that's coming from the body, that's going to be low. There's going to be very little oxygen in it. It's mainly going to be carbon dioxide and water vapor. So what will happen is these oxygen molecules that are in a high concentration here will actually naturally transfer into this area that's of low concentration. So again, if we look at this, so what's going to happen is, imagine this is like oxygen here that's concentrated in this space. Okay, so it's concentrated. What's going to happen is it's going to spread out. Okay, so it's going to move out into these areas here, which there's a low concentration. So this is a process that's known as diffusion. So basically you have a high concentration of gas here, and it moves into an area of low concentration. So it starts to kind of spread out naturally. And the same thing happens then as well. So for example, when you have blood that's coming from the body, you're going to have, for example, in here, you're going to have like a high concentration of CO2 and H2O, water vapor. And it's going to move from this area of high concentration into this area in here, for example, of low concentration. And then it'll move out of the body. So this is just the process of diffusion. And this is how, for example, gas is exchanged from the lungs into the bloodstream in these little air sacs that are known as alveolus. And remember, if we think about it as well, so if we think about the process of, or the formula for respiration, so respiration. So we have C6H12O6, okay, which is glucose, plus oxygen, and that's going to give us carbon dioxide, CO2, plus H2O, which is water vapor, and plus we're going to get energy. So respiration is the release of energy from food. So again, this is the glucose, this is the oxygen, this is the carbon dioxide. This is water vapor. And then this is the energy that's produced. So again, if we have a look in here, so what's happening is, so the oxygen, we're actually taking it from the air. So this is the oxygen here that we're talking about. So this is the oxygen, for example, that we have to take in. So this is the oxygen here that we're talking about here in diffusion. And then in the body, in the cells, for example, this is where respiration takes place. So these waste products are going to be produced, CO2 and H2O. And those CO2 and H2O, we get rid of them out of the body through the lungs as well. And so they come from the body, for example, up to these into the capillaries, and then from the capillaries into the alveolus, and then from the alveolus then they're going to go up through the tubes, up through the trachea, and then we're going to breathe them out. So this is like it's linking in this whole process with what we've learned about respiration. And remember, respiration is very important. It's how our body it's how our body basically produces energy, gets the energy from food in order for us to be able to keep warm and for our body to be able to function as well. So this is so when we're talking about gas exchange or the alveolus, this is what we're talking about, these tiny little air sacs that are in here. And this is like the interface between the lungs and the circulatory system. So hopefully that makes sense, and thank you for listening.